Hey, hello everyone. Thanks so much for bearing with us. We were trying to work out a few technical details here just before we got started. I'm going to give it just a few more seconds. We have a few people trickling in right now at 2 o'clock. All right. Here we go. Looks like everyone's settling in. So thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm Katie Monahan, and I'm a communications strategist here at the Ohio Arts Council. I am a white woman with shoulder-length blonde hair, and I'm wearing a black and white vertical striped button-down shirt. Behind me is a cream-colored wall with some artwork hanging on it and a black bookshelf full of photos, books, and artwork. I am also the coordinator of the OAC's monthly webinar series, and I am really pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Reframing Disability. So we are really excited to partner with our friends at Artreach for today's presentation, and I will introduce our presenter here in just a minute. But before we dive in, there are, of course, just a few housekeeping items that we need to go over. So first, everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode, but if you do have a question at any point, go ahead and type that into the Q&A box there in your control panel. We'll monitor those questions as we go along throughout the webinar, and we'll be sure to leave plenty of time at the end to answer all of them. And please remember to use the Q&A if possible and not the chat. It's just easier to track questions that way, and I don't want to miss anybody. Next, live captioning is available for this webinar, and you can access those captions by clicking on the closed captioning icon on your control panel. And if you have audio issues or trouble connecting, we recommend refreshing your browser. And if that doesn't work, try logging off and logging back in. And also, please keep in mind that because we are presenting from different locations, there may be some variations in bandwidth or internet stability. So if the sound fluctuates or one of us freezes up for a minute, thank you in advance for bearing with us. I promise you we will keep on rolling through any little technical snafus. And finally, we are recording today's webinar, and the recording will be available on our webinars page at oac.ohio.gov/webinars and on our YouTube channel by early next week. And everyone who is registered for this webinar will also get a follow-up email containing a link to the recording and a copy of the slide deck. Great, that's it for housekeeping. Before I introduce today's presenter, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to my colleague, Kim Turner. Many of you may know Kim. She is the go-to, she works in our investment office, but she also serves as the agency's accessibility coordinator. And Kim is our go-to when organizations have questions about meeting ADA requirements. She's also available to assist grant applicants with disabilities with their applications and help accommodate them if accommodations are needed. And she also coordinates the OAC staff accessibility training, and she is responsible for connecting us with today's presenter, Katie Samson. So Katie is the Director of Education at Artreach, an organization devoted to an organization devoted to increasing cultural participation among traditionally underrepresented audiences in the disability and low-income sectors. Based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the nonprofit creates, advocates for, and expands accessible opportunities in the arts. So, we have lost Katie. Oh dear. Sit tight, everyone. I think she may have fallen off. We lost her. Oh, there she is. She's back. Having some internet stability issues already. We'll just tune in here. I will say while we're waiting for Katie to rejoin us, if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to, for those of you who came in late, there you are, Katie, we lost you for a minute.
Yes, my complete computer, everything just shut down, but I am back. These things happen after doing many webinars over the years. You sort of just take a breath and know that I'll connect back with you all at some point, and here I am. So hi.
So this is Katie Samson, our esteemed presenter today. Katie, we're so glad to have you here with us. Thanks so much for taking the time to be here and talk to us. We'll give you a few seconds here to get settled and get your presentation up and going, and then I'll let you kind of take it from here.
That's great. Thank you so much. And apologies for the technical difficulties. Can you see my slide okay, and my screen share and everything?
It looks great. Yep.
Okay, great. So we're going to jump in and get started. I just want to thank you all so much. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. This is really a treat. I'm excited to speak with all of you. My name is Katie Samson. I am a rosy-cheeked, freckled, white, cis disabled woman with blonde hair pulled back in a tight clip. I'm wearing a pink striped shirt with a black sweater over it. And although you can't tell from the Zoom frame, I'm seated in a wheelchair. Behind me is a cream colored wall with paintings, prints, and photographs. The title slide reads Reframing Disability, and actually shows a photograph of an inclusive dance workshop with 4 young people with intellectual disabilities balancing on one foot in a ballet studio. One of the things I like to do before we begin is to talk about the way in which disability studies and disability justice work are always thinking about how design is a series of political decisions that could be made otherwise. So in the spirit of making the design of spaces more apparent of what they provide and what they don't provide, i.e. accessibility, I have a few access notes before we begin. This presentation is made available for you as a PDF to follow along on your own. And Katie's gonna do me a favor and drop that link in the chat. So if you all wanna follow along on your own without, or at a later time, please feel free to do so. Also, in the spirit of the disability movement, I have learned along the way the importance of thinking about access as a collective activity made up by all the people in this Zoom. So please do whatever you need to do while I'm talking to be able to be here. You can come and go, you can lie down on the floor, get up and move around. Part of what makes spaces inclusive and accessible is the ability to do what you need to do without any judgment. I would be delighted if I could see you right now that you're maybe playing with a fidget toy or sketching or just maybe standing up, because I also know that you're claiming this space. So thank you for doing that. I will also be at this volume and at this pace for the presentation, but should you need me to slow down, please feel free to indicate so in the chat, and I'll do my best to do so. So I am the Director of Education at Artreach. Artreach is a team of disabled and non-disabled advocates and educators, artists, and allies who work to make the arts and cultural spaces more accessible for the disabled by the disabled. As a team, we believe that art is a human right, and opportunities to engage within the arts should be enabled to everyone. We understand there is an intersectional relationship between disability, race, and poverty, and integral to our approach is to learn from the lived experience of our community to create lasting change. One example of this work can be seen in this image that's on your slide of an audio described sensory tour of the Philadelphia Flower Show, which takes place annually here in Philadelphia. This accessible and inclusive event invites people who are blind, low vision, or with sensory sensitivities to experience a tour of the special exhibits with an audio describer, along with touch and smell components as well. This slide depicts a tall brown-skinned woman with short dark hair wearing a white embroidered blouse. She has her eyes slightly closed as she touches a large maple leaf, which is part of a display of sphere-shaped balls with sprouting leaves. So what we're going to actually be talking about today is we're going to break down reframing disability into these 3 sections. We're going to talk about the introduction of cultural humility, to sort of learn those concepts and identify areas possibly within your organization and within your own individual practice that you can build more awareness around access work. Then we're going to talk about a few examples of models of disability and how they situate themselves within the organizations where you all are situated. And then lastly, we're going to spend some time on language and etiquette. We're going to talk about some current trends that are existing, as well as some best practices in talking about people with disabilities, and specifically of how specific groups of people with disabilities choose to identify themselves. Take a slight slip of water here. So, cultural humility has become more recognized in the nonprofit sector. It is an important shift in mindset. If organizations wish to authentically and intentionally benefit the communities they serve. It is not only related to effective leadership and management, but also a departure from the traditional view of cultural competency. Instead of focusing on mastery, cultural humility recognizes that we all have something to learn from one another. Arts and cultural organizations have areas within them that cause harm to those they wish to support, albeit unintentionally. Cultural humility builds trust and acknowledges that organizations don't know everything, will make mistakes, and must account for their own biases. Things may get messy, and failure is an option. Developing self-awareness and humility equips organizations to build healthy partnerships. This first step in this process, acknowledging that you don't know everything, and often the experts are people with their own lived experience to share. And I like to frame this conversation of cultural humility around the work of the regular DEAI that may be going on within the organization. It's recognizing the diversity of needs in your community and being responsive to that. For example, I recently gave a presentation to Ohio State of Cultural Affairs, and in looking at the census data and the prevalence of disability within the state of Iowa, that looks very different from the community that we are serving in our local partnerships here at Outreach. And so I think it's really interesting that when you look at the numbers, you look at the data, and you think about how you're responding to the diversity of needs in that community, that can look really different depending on your regions. And so a lot of the values that are set, those core values that are set for your organization, need to weave a lot of these practices throughout, considering these unique circumstances and situations, and really thinking about disability rights are civil and human rights. And I really love this visual example, which was first supported by the Kennedy Center work and Betty Siegel, who's the head of access at the Kennedy Center. And one of the things that Betty does when she talks about recognizing these core values is that it is constantly cyclical. It's not a check the box moment where, okay, we've satisfied this accessibility need and this accessibility need, and we can now move on. It is always going to be re-examined, evaluated. Policies, procedures, and practices may be updated on a yearly basis, on a 3 to 5 year strategic plan. And so, but what is interesting is when you frame this within the context of cultural humility, it really builds that understanding, recognizing challenges to power imbalances, and de-emphasizing that cultural knowledge and competency. And one of the things that I think is the most important takeaway of cultural humility is this willingness to accurately assess oneself and one's limitations, the ability to acknowledge gaps in our own knowledge, and the openness to new ideas, perhaps contradictory information, and seeking out advice. And in the context of learning about people with disabilities, it's actually seeking out advice from people with that lived experience. And thinking about, we all bring our own personal beliefs, our own personal experiences with disability, also our own unconscious bias and our own baggage. And so when we go through this first exercise that I'm going to introduce to you all, I just want you to think about, really just take a moment for yourself in this space as we go through this observational exercise. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a video that was created about 5 years ago from an organization that's based out of the UK called Scope. What I would like you to do is to have a moment of self-reflection and self-recognition in which we talk about the awkward experiences and interactions that you may have had in which disability was a factor. Okay.
Two-thirds of British people feel awkward around disability. Scope are teaming up with the Southern Cooperative to help end the awkward. We used actors to show real-life stories.
Excuse me, do you need any help? Are you okay?
Yes, that would be great. Would you mind helping me find some flowers?
Yes, come this way. I think you're so brave for coming out on your own and doing the shopping by yourself.
Excuse me, mate.
Yeah,
Could you reach me down the tin of tomatoes, please?
absolutely. Actually, I think these are being more manageable for you to carry.
Lovely day. Strawberries, my favourite.
We like strawberries.
That's £8.80, please.
Sorry, how much?
£8.80, please.
Thank you.
Thank you. Here's your change and your receipt.
Thank you.
Have a nice day. Feeling awkward yet? It doesn't have to be.
Not all impairments are visible. You're right.
Excuse me, do you need any help? Are you okay?
Remember, help is always welcome. But I'm blind, not deaf.
It's just a couple of sips.
Excuse me, mate. Shopping can be annoying at the best of times. If asked for help, I really appreciate it. But please don't make assumptions. Excuse me, mate. Could you pass down the tin of tomatoes, please?
Yeah, sure, no worries. Here we go.
Thanks.
That's £8.80, please.
Sorry, how much? Just because I'm disabled, you don't need to feel awkward. Just talk to me like anybody else.
There's your change and your receipt. Have a nice day. Find out more about how you can end the awkward at scope.org.uk/awkward.
Okay. So within the framework of cultural humility that brings us closer into view about speaking about people with disabilities is this concept of self-recognition. We understand and we move forward in this work as wanting to do better which often takes the place of self-acknowledgement. And this part can really get uncomfortable. We need to embrace discomfort in order to learn and build empathy, awareness, and become allies. So the sort of takeaway and message that you can draw from a video like this can be very, very individual. An experience that you may have had in which you maybe said something you didn't feel comfortable saying, or you didn't say something in which you could have perhaps stepped in and been an ally in a situation. So the what did you do or what didn't you do? But then also that Monday morning quarterbacking, what would you have done differently in that moment? And so this is just a moment to sort of pause and think about that in the course of this presentation, and perhaps we'll come back to this thought at the end or during our Q&A as well. The next thing I want to do is move on.
Thank you.
Move on to talk about the different. Oops, sorry, I have the wrong slide up. Is to talk about the different variations within disability as we transition from talking about cultural humility and introducing that concept to really understanding how disability is framed in critical disability studies under what we're going to talk about today is 3 different models. Now, there are a lot of different models to talk about disability studies and to talk about people with disabilities. For the purposes of today and our time, we're going to cover 3, and we're going to cover 3 that almost take on a timeline in the course of history of the disability rights movement as well. So when we think about the medical model of disability, how oftentimes do you go to the doctor and talk about all the good things that are happening in your body or in your mind? Yeah, not so often, right? You're talking about like that funny pain in your elbow or that weird rash on your shoulder, or you're talking about your aches and your pains and your traumas. It's a place that you go for correction or realignment, right? So the medical model is really viewing disability as a problem of the person that needs medical intervention and requires a professional to make that intervention happen. So that is where disability was framed for many, many years, right? In the 19th century, we institutionalized many disabled people and we kept them out of view. That took course almost into more than halfway through the 20th century, when we finally recognized this idea of the disability rights movement and more inclusive practices. We started seeing more inclusion into our school systems, our workforces, although I have to say we've got a lot more work to do when it comes to employment. But suffice it to say, the social model of disability really came about around the time that we started really pushing the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA was passed in 1990, and we started looking at all of these barriers, whether there were barriers to our civil rights, like voting access, or barriers to just mailing a letter at our local post office. So the social model really turns that idea of the medical model on its head and proposes that what makes a person disabled is not actually their medical condition, but the structures and barriers of society. And those can be broken down into 5 very distinctive categories. And we all know the number 1 category because it's really been pushed. It's been pushed out the most in the time frame of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Excuse me. So that would be the physical barriers of society. So we think about stairs, elevators, ramps, curb cuts, things like that. But also in the physical barriers, we have to think about lighting. Poor lighting can be a physical barrier for someone who may have some ambulatory challenges or might have low vision. Also thinking about doorknobs, if there's a round doorknob, someone perhaps with arthritis or limited hand function may have a difficulty opening a door. Also, the weight of a door can be a major physical barrier. And then lastly, we think of counter heights, counter spaces. I can't tell you how excited I was when my local brewery decided to rebuild their bar, and they built about 8 feet at the end of their bar to be wheelchair accessible. And I was like, this place was built for me. This bar was built for me. This beer was brewed for me. So it was like a really great feeling to know that that physical barrier wasn't going to exist in that specific place. And that can do such positive things to a person with disabilities place in the world. The other barriers that exist within the social model are communication barriers, organizational barriers, technology, and attitude. And I'll get to talking about a few of those in detail in a little bit. And lastly, I want to talk about the affirmation model, because as a person with a disability, we're coming at a very, very crucial time in which we start to recognize the social justice movement, the disability justice movement, and the way in which we look at disability as a non-tragic view that encompasses positive social identities that are grounded in the lifestyle and lived experience about what it's like to either have an impairment, to have an activity restriction, to have a disability. So that could be chronic illness, or that could be, depression and anxiety. So whether or not the view of that person is coming from a place of neutrality and not from a place of pity, or at the other end of that spectrum, a place of hero worship or something like that. So for those of you who are more visual learners, I like to use this as an example to think about the medical model as the issue is of the individual and what the individual needs to do to, try to solve some of those problems under that framework, solutions-based, intervention-based, versus the social model is the issue is the inaccessible world, and the world needs to fix itself, and in whatever space I might navigate throughout that space. And then lastly, the affirmation model, you can sort of think about it as I myself, as a person with a disability, am disabled in whatever world exists, and the positive affirmations that I can have about myself and my identity are directly reflected in what can and can't happen in those spaces. So similar to how I was speaking in my introduction about design and spaces can be a political act, and how that political act can be one that is really life affirming for folks with disabilities. So if we take a closer look at the medical model, first and foremost, the Center for Disease Control defines disability as a condition of the body or mind that makes it more difficult for a person with a condition to do certain activities and to interact with the world. And they're broken down into, that's impairment, activity limitation, and participation restriction. And participation restriction can be something as simple, well, I shouldn't say simple, but something as temporary as your third trimester as a person who's pregnant. So that falls under the category of temporary disability. The way in which these categories are broken down is not exhaustive by any means. And there is a lot of intersection that happens. So for example, I have a mobility disability. I have a spinal cord injury, which is also an acquired disability. I was in an accident when I was 20 years old sledding, and I broke my neck. So I spent the first 20 years of my life non-disabled as a very upright and athletic and ambulatory person. And then I had an injury or an acquired disability that caused me paralysis, in which I now use a wheelchair. I also have a sensory disability. So I have single-sided deafness and vestibular damage in my inner ear of my right vestibular nerve system. So oftentimes you'll find that there are people who have multiple disabilities, and it's very difficult to categorize just into one specific area. What's also really interesting about sensory disability is we know so much more now about the 8 human senses. Yes, I said 8, not 5, than we did when we were in kindergarten and we learned about the senses. And what's really interesting to me and very exciting about where we are in our sector, in the arts and cultural sector, we are finding ways to build in programming, to build in experiences, to be more inclusive for people with sensory disabilities beyond what is required from the Americans with Disabilities Act. And one example of that is relaxed experiences or sensory-friendly experiences that you might find often in performing arts venues, in garden spaces, in museums. And what I love about the activation of these events and these programs in these spaces is we're actually, whether perhaps we know it or not, we're tapping into those extra 3 senses that often get ignored or misunderstood. And those being proprioceptive, so our need to move throughout gravity. Many people with sensory disabilities are born without that sense of gravitational pull. And so they might have more rocking or like need to sort of keep moving throughout the space. Or someone that perhaps was born with a little too much movement and requires sort of that stability or that sense. And so we also have vestibular, as I mentioned before. Vestibular, I like to think of it as your cat whiskers. That's your inner nerve within your ear, and that's your balance nerve. And oftentimes that balance nerve can be disrupted for a person who is neurodivergent or ADHD, or someone on the autism spectrum or sensory processing disorder. And then lastly, the other sense or the hidden sense that we talk about is interoception. Is the way that I think about it is like your body's ability to recognize its own natural urges or natural sort of feelings about hunger, thirst, bowel and bladder, but also things like if you get flushed or being ticklish or getting embarrassed, your blood pressure goes up or something like that. And so oftentimes we find that some of these playgrounds, these new playgrounds that we're seeing being developed for children are really tapping into some of these components of sensory disabilities that we know so much more about now than we did before, which I think is also very, very exciting. And just to also point out that the last category here, other health impairments, is a category that was added under the Obama administration and the amendments to the ADA in 2010. So that's things like asthma, diabetes, sickle cell, Crohn's, colitis, and certain like lung and health impairments as well. When we think about the affirmation model and spending a little bit of time on the affirmation model is really interesting because it's most succinctly expressed through disability arts and art forms and artworks created by disabled people to be shared with and to inform other disabled people by focusing on the truth of the experience. And I really love this quote by Carolyn Lazar, the artist, that disabled people and cross-disability collectivity are complex, and I think we deserve our complexity. And just sharing here some of these really great examples of artists like Riva Lair, who's really painted this dynamic portrait, mixed media of herself that shows strength. It shows fierceness, but it also shows, levels of femininity, of grit, and that complexity that Lazard is also speaking with Excel. And what I find really interesting is when we look at how the medical model, how the social model, and how the affirmation model show up in our work. So as we reframe disability when it comes to the context of working in a museum or working in a performing arts space or historic site, we used to ask these questions like, well, tell me what's wrong with you, or what are your problems with accessing our program or our garden space or our event, or based on your limitations, I think you'd be better off doing this. So we call that segregation, right? Under the social model, we say, well, tell me what's wrong with this environment, or what's wrong with this virtual experience. How can we best accommodate you through adaptation? Or how can we create experiences that are more inclusive through design, through sort of this political act, as I mentioned earlier, as making inclusive spaces as best we can. And then lastly, the question that I would ask myself when thinking about this image that you're seeing here on the right is a topographic view of accessibly designed garden beds called terraforms that have come out of France. I'd love to get my hands on one in the United States. But if I were to come across something like this in a public garden, and I could wheel up and touch the flowers and taste them and smell them and have that access right as if it's like my desktop space, thinking about, well, does this garden affirm a positive experience in my mind about myself and my disability? Well, absolutely. It was designed for me. It was meant for me. It was built for me. It is intentional. It's inclusive. And it also has that sort of spread effect, a positive spread effect, in that it does benefit multiple needs, not just a person in a wheelchair, but perhaps a young toddler who wants to step up on a platform and see things, a person of short stature, or a little person, or someone else with a alternative mobility device. The last thing I just wanted to touch on in the social model is that beyond just the attitudinal barriers that exist, whether that's ableism, disability prejudice, as I mentioned before, hero worship, or fear, and fear being really the biggest, sort of not knowing what to say, not knowing what to do, and not knowing who to ask. Communication barriers and information barriers often go hand in hand. And that can be broken down into things as simple as having captioning to an ASL interpreter that could be present. Also thinking about communication as far as language. How are your words displayed in your didactic information or in your brochures? Is the font easy to read? Is your social media post have alternative text for someone who uses a screen reader? And so with that, we talk about technology, because there's so much technology out there that has created such enhancements for people with disabilities, and the screen reader being just one of those examples. But if our websites aren't designed properly to be utilized with this technology, if our social media doesn't allow us to plug in image description, alternative text, captioning, then we are making the world more inaccessible, maybe unintentionally, because we don't know what we don't know, but the information is now out there and it is readily available. And it really behooves us in these moments to take the time and to learn these best practices so we can bring more audiences into our spaces. And lastly, the organizational barriers are also these unintentional consequences as a result of nonprofit hierarchical management, of sort of a lot of a lot of things that have just been sort of embedded within the cultural practice without anybody coming to question why. Like, why do we only ask to hear resumes in one type of format and one type of method and one type of way, rather than perhaps by audio or by video or different types of methodology, right? Because we have whole generations of young people that have come into the workforce with inclusion in their rearview mirror. And so when they step into organizational practices that have these barriers, they don't really have the proper tools and guidance to navigate, because inclusion was set out for them throughout maybe their childhood, their education system. Accommodations were made when they were in university and colleges, and then they get into the workforce and find that people don't know exactly how to work with a person with a disability. So it's really on us to try to do better in this way. So how do we start to address these barriers? We start to look at accommodation and inclusive design. So I like to frame it with these types of questions. When we think about accommodation, the issue is actually my problem to solve as a disabled person when it comes to accommodation. So right now, let's say I'm really hungry after this presentation and I want to go to this new restaurant that someone told me about. So I might visit their website. Does it say anything about whether or not they're wheelchair accessible? Of course not. Rarely does. Can I get a Google view, street view of their entrance to see if there's even a step or perhaps a push button entrance for me to get into? Doesn't show that. So I call up the space, and the burden is still on me to make that call, to try to get someone on the phone. And so that's, and we can go from there. Whether that person is answering the phone has actually the knowledge to tell me whether or not I can enter into the space. I can't tell you how many times I get we're accessible, it's just one step. It's like, well, it's not going to work, right? So a lot of these access needs are achieved through accommodation. They're achieved through retrofitting. So you build in those accommodations into your organization in various ways. Perhaps you introduce the captioning on your webinars, like we're seeing here today. Perhaps you have a few events throughout the year and you wish to build in accommodations for ASL interpreters. So you put some line items in your budget for accessibility. So you want to welcome in the deaf community or deaf patrons. And so thinking about requests for public accommodation and access services should be guaranteed under Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act. But who is taking on that burden? The person with the disability to make those requests. So then we have inclusive design, which is my jam and something that I really truly believe in. If it is intentional, if it's presented with thought and care and time, you need to roll out a really good timeline. So we think about access issues are the designer's task to discover creative solutions. You notice I didn't say problem solving, right? I'm not a problem to be solved. I am a task to discover creative solutions. So what's the next project? What's the next program that you can start working on to build more inclusive practices? So I encourage you to start thinking about that. We're in that time of year where we're programming for fall. We're programming for that fall lecture series or that exhibition that's coming up the pike, or can I get another $5,000 grant funding from my local developmental disability council to offer up the opportunity for workforce development, something to that degree, right? We think about environments and programs are designed to the greatest extent for the critical user, i.e. the person with the disability, as well as the augmented user, and that's everybody else benefits. We call this the curb cut effect because it is proactive and it is multifunctional. And in doing so, we eliminate something called forced intimacy or forced disclosure. And so oftentimes taking that burden on of making that phone call, it can feel uncomfortable. It's not oftentimes that you're sharing your personal medical information with a complete stranger about your access needs. By building inclusive practices, you eliminate forced intimacy in a lot of different areas. And so I encourage you all to think about that and how that might make you feel that day after day, you have to place those requests rather than have them automatically available, what I can't tell you how welcoming it is to come into a webinar and have captioning available, AI captioning available. And so it's like, thank you, Zoom. I know it took a long time and we waited and waited and waited, but it is really tremendous. When it's often available and can be made affordable through budgeting, I always encourage cart services. That is a labor that should be paid for. It's accurate, and it also gets with the other sounds and the other, qualities of noise, and it identifies speakers, which I think is also very helpful. So as you see here with this image that I'm showing, this sort of a little bit of a tease, but the example here with an escalator, it's retroactive, it's separate, and it often benefits non-disabled people more often than it benefits a person with a disability. But I mean, who doesn't love a curb cut, right? Your service animals are taught how to identify it through those raised bumps and knowing where the crosswalk is. It has cane detection for a person who is blind using a sight cane. It is skid protection on those icy roads or wet days. Also, your prime packages, your UPS driver, right? They're going to be able to wheel right up that curb pretty easily, as well as someone like myself with a power wheelchair, or perhaps my neighbor who uses a walker. So gotta love that inclusive design. And there's so many other really great examples that I know are happening in arts and cultural spaces. And I'd love to hear more thoughts and questions around this as we get to the Q&A. I know we're a little short of time because of technical challenges, so I'm going to actually skip the short video I had to present, and I encourage you to take a look at it if you have an opportunity. You can find it on YouTube as well, and it's called We the 15. So I'm going to skip over our next slide for the purposes of time, but encourage you to check it out. I also have a hyperlink at the very end of the PDF as well. So our last part is going to talk about language and etiquette. And I think to frame this as we're in a really interesting time in which there's a lot of different generations that are talking about disability in different moments, and they're using different language. And I think each person's identity is their own preference. And I think to frame that first and foremost, before we get into a conversation, is important to understand that one individual person may have their own preference in which, it's perfectly fine to just riff off of whatever they, however they feel. But it's important to also think about that a lot of language around disability has been by non-disabled people, that culture is not homogenous. And language is always changing. It is always fluid. It is constantly flowing. I have my younger sister is 15 years younger than I am. And she is, the other day she told me that I couldn't use the word fire, like for something cool, because I was too old and it just sounded weird. And I was devastated. But I was like, well, I've got my own language and my own generation, Gen Xers have that, might sound weird for her to say. So, yeah, but it was a little disappointing in that way too. We also have to think about euphemistic language as seen in this slide here. Words like handy-capable or differently abled. Really, euphemisms are made to make able-bodied people feel more comfortable about saying the word disability. Disability is not a bad word. It is an identity. It is a community. It is a body-mind experience. It is all three things. It is one of those things, two of those things, or all three of those things. So to be respectful of the community, of the identity group, and to use the word freely. I think it is really important to adopt as practice. The way in which we differentiate right now between language is using person first and identity first language. And we're really at a cusp right now where it's used simultaneously. And I personally use both. Oftentimes you'll hear me say person with a disability as well as disabled person. And obviously it's broken down into these areas, but I think it's really important to recognize that it is a journey for all of us. So thinking about person first being sort of demonstrates an awareness and a sensitivity to positive societal change. But identity first is really rooted in a staple of pride amongst your community. And so this next chart really breaks down this language into person first. I've indicated in blue where you have identity first language preferences within specific demographic groups, as well as language to avoid. And you'd be surprised. Sometimes I do this presentation and people say, like, I didn't think those words were still around, and yet, just recently within the past 3 years, we started to seeing a major shift in the disability community around the term special needs, as well as nonverbal. So those went to language to avoid categories, in which we now use AAC, or a person who is an augmented communicator, alternative or augmented communicator, as well as I like to use the term variable learner as opposed to a student with special needs, because we all learn differently and different paces and different structures and different methodologies. Also, you'll notice that within the deaf community, deaf people view themselves as having a cultural difference rather than a disability, because they have their own language with using American Sign Language. So I think that is something that I think is really key to understanding the deaf community and deaf culture in and of itself, and to really respect the language and how important that is, and different it is from captioning. Providing captionings for the deaf community is like providing Spanish to the English community. It's a different language. And to be respectful of that cultural difference, I think is making sure your organization is adopting the core values of a cultural community. In the physical disability, the term CRIP is often used among my friends or among my peers in the disability movement or the social justice movement. We talk about CRIP time all the time. Is sometimes it takes us a long time to do something, to say something, to get somewhere. And so, like, that understanding CRIP time and kind of what that's about, whether you're hosting an event or inviting a community to your space for the first time, understanding the journey matrix of disability and how that works within the scope of CRIP time. But I'm happy to answer any questions on this when we get to the Q&A, because I know this is a lot. But using either person first language or identity first language, and making someone feel really comfortable with how they express themselves. And then lastly, just trying to shy away from affliction language, like impaired, afflicted by, confined to a wheelchair, suffering from, things like that. And then just lastly, I have basic points of etiquette, disability etiquette, but and some resources at the end as you're moving within this space. So as you start to build your audiences and really embrace the disability community in Ohio and continuing the programming that you're already doing, it's important to revisit this etiquette and to understand the community, perhaps bringing in inviting your staff to get trained. Shameless plug, we do trainings all across the country. on various topics related to accessibility and inclusion, as well as etiquette training for frontline workers. But I think these are just some important key points to not ask a person about the disability. Always start from a service perspective, always bring it back to accommodation, and being patient about the time it takes someone to say something or do something, and just being natural about it, not infantilizing or crouching down to speak to someone in a wheelchair, but just a willingness to offer up help. And if it's accepted, great. But if not to be offended by it. And really anticipating accommodations and services for a person with a disability might need. If you're inviting a speaker to your space, maybe they're not going to use that podium. They might want a lavalier mic instead of having to hold a microphone. Or is there an accessible restroom they can use? And if not, what is your solution for that? Respecting accessible parking spaces, I think, is really key. I can't tell you how many times I've been to places in which they haven't adequately addressed their accessible parking, or the signage is incorrect, or they don't have control over the space, but don't have any advocacy or allyship in how to proceed to make that better or more achievable. Just a few more, speaking directly to a person with a disability, making that eye contact, but also understanding that eye contact isn't for everybody. Not everybody likes to shake hands. Never to pretend to understand what a person is saying, and you can ask the person to repeat or rephrase. And also remembering that a temporary disability does not mean you fully grasp the experience of another person's disability, which is articulated in this screenshot of one of my favorite episodes from The Office, in which the boss, Michael Scott, accidentally burns his foot on a George Foreman grill cooking bacon in his bed, and tries to use the accessible parking spot at Dunder Mifflin. It's a great episode. And then using common vernacular. We just talked about language, but nice to see you. You're going to walk down the hall. Don't feel like you have to modify your language to accommodate a person who is blind or uses a wheelchair or something like that. I can tell you it's so awkward when someone says, like, well, you're going to roll down this way. I'm like, I just say walk. I haven't walked in 23 years, but I still use it every day. Treating adults as adults, not patronizing or talking down to a person. And relaxing, taking a breath, offering an apology, sense of humor, and a willingness to communicate and do better if you make a mistake. Lastly, just a couple recommendations before we get to the Q&A, and I'm happy to stay on a little extra time if needed. But just a plug for my dear friend, Emily Ladeau, who has this wonderful book, Demystifying Disability. It's great as an all-staff read or a DEAI read within your task force, so to speak. I also think that Diversability is a really wonderful community to follow on Instagram, to take some of their webinars. They have a really great disability leadership collective as well, and they're always just doing such great work. They're based in California, but there's just a great resource to follow. Lastly, for your professional learning and development in this space, you can join us at Artreach. We run a cohort. It's a leading and emerging accessibility professionals that goes on for 8 months, and it starts up in October of this year. It's really a great way that each month we take a deep dive into accessible services. So how to best prepare to welcome people who are blind and low vision, and what types of services and programs are available. Same thing for deaf community and deaf culture. We do a deep dive into ASL and how to best prepare your ASL interpreters, things like that. Then we host an online conference October 3rd through the 5th that's completely online, completely virtual, and it's the cheapest conference you'll ever go to. So registration's open for that in August. And then we also have a YouTube channel Outreach Philly that has lots of recordings of previous webinars and previous trainings as well. But at this opportunity, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and hopefully we can get to some Q&A as well. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Katie. At the risk of making your sister cringe, that presentation was straight fire. You did it.
Oh.
But no, seriously, we really appreciate all of the resources and the additional PD opportunities. And I just want to remind everyone that we will be sending around a copy of the slide deck with all of the resources and hyperlinks to everything that Katie mentioned today. There are a few questions, and if you're willing to stick around with us for a little bit, I think we'll go ahead and dive into a few of those. So somebody is asking, let's see, we'll start back up at the top. So you talked a little bit about some euphemisms that maybe would be best to stay away from. Would you mind just kind of popping in and revisiting a few of those as a refresher really quick?
Yeah, I mean, I think differing abilities is the one that kind of irks me the most, because it's so close to disability by not just saying disability. So that's one. The other one, I think it was handy capable, is the one that sometimes I get a little bit too. I think just in general, like stop saying the word handicap is probably the best bet, because for any time you can think of the word handicap, you can use accessible. So accessible parking, accessible spaces, accessible elevator, accessible ramp, a person with access needs, rather than a handicapped person, handicapped parking, handicapped space. It's just that it almost like became a euphemism, and then it became like signage, and then it became just sort of the method. And it's basically like a term for gambling, you know, sort of like weighting one person over the other, or like weighing down a horse in horse track betting. And like, you know, people with disabilities carry enough burdens on their own. They don't need the extra weight of language on top of it. And so that's sort of one of the ways that I think if there's any takeaways, it's like, and being an ally about, you know, if you hear someone saying the word handicap, like, oh, I was just at this webinar and I don't think we're supposed to use that anymore. Or like, I'm trying not to say it as much, especially when it comes to people, you know. I think parking, it's going to take some time, but yeah.
Thank you. Let's see, we'll go through here. Someone is asking, are there best practices for reporters or media writers within organizations as they try to write about these issues, or maybe as they address them in their marketing, like resources that they can use to make sure to refer to make sure they're doing the right things?
Absolutely. I love to refer people to, the Walter Cronkite Institute at the Arizona State University has a dictionary related to disability that they update annually. And it's a really, really wonderful resource. And there's times where I've reached out to them when I've had a question about, for example, we were trying to do marketing around vaccines a few years ago that were for people who couldn't leave their home. And the term was like homebound. And I have this sort of like bound up thing about like, well, that person's not like tied up in the basement. They just, you know, they're immunocompromised and they don't have adequate services to get out of their home. Like, what is a better way of saying homebound? And so it was interesting having communication with them because they didn't have that up on the language guide, but there was someone that I could refer to that we could kind of talk through some of the language around not saying homebound. But yeah, it's a great resource, and what I like about it is it's at a university, so there's constant academic sort of attention being driven to this, and then sort of crowdsourced within the communities that they serve as well.
Fantastic, thank you. I have a question as an events coordinator. I thought it was so interesting how you talked about eliminating forced disclosure. And I have to admit, we have definitely done that just in an effort to make sure that we do accommodate everyone. Do you have recommendations on, so obviously, closed captioning when it's available, and you mentioned, adding information about wheelchair accessibility and things like that to maybe your event page ahead of time or to your gallery page ahead of time. Is it still okay, or would you still recommend to still include that if you need additional accommodations, reach out? Is that
Absolutely, absolutely. Like, especially, some people have access needs, like a nursing, a nursing young parent is going to probably need, maybe have that need to pump or something like that. And that's not necessarily like listing every single person's, like, designing for every single person's need is not necessarily that adequate, but, listing all of those things can be like a whole nother invitation. So oftentimes that can be really satisfied by the use of icons. So like the ASL interpreter icon, an audio AD for audio description icon, CC for captioning, like a wheelchair symbol for mobility access. Like, I think icons really go a long way, and they've been around for so long that the disability community like looks for them. And so if they don't see an icon, they're sort of like, maybe I have to make that request, and making that request I can't do right now, or I can't make that call, or they don't give me a number to dial or an email up to a specific person. It's like it goes to a general info something or other. So I think some of those little details can be helpful. It's like, reach out to Katie at this phone number and this email address. And so you're actually talking to a human, and it's just not going to sort of a pool of other like frequently asked questions or something like that too.
That's helpful. Thank you. Yeah, just so they don't feel like they're being tossed out into the abyss somewhere. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we were about 10 minutes over, so I think we're coming up on time here today, but I just wanted to say again, thank you so much, Katie, for taking the time. This has really been fantastic. I know I've been taking notes as you've gone through, and I'm sure everyone tuning in today has learned a lot as well. I just wanted to remind everyone that we will share a copy of the recording and a copy of the slide deck probably early next week. We'll try and get that out to you. I know it's the long weekend coming up, but we will do our best to get that out very soon. And other than that, if you have any questions, I'll have Katie's contact information and my contact information in that email as well. And I guess that does it for today. Thank you all so much for taking the time to tune in. And Katie, thank you once again. It's been great having you.
Thank you. And have a great rest of your day, and happy Memorial Day weekend. And thank you all so much for attending.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.